When it comes to the underlying problem, it's I think that already Tatjana and also Jelena introduced that to you. One of the main problem is that globally, if all women were to be excluded from the labor force, the income per capita would be reduced by almost 40%. So gender equality is something what we necessarily need to increase the welfare in all countries, not only in the Western or industrialized countries, but all over the world. But at the moment, women only generate 37% of the GDP, and especially when it comes to SME, they only run a third of it. That's what we already heard when it comes to female entrepreneurship. And especially in developing countries, this goes down to 3 to 6%. This is especially in developing countries, not a figure which helps to increase also the development of a country. Another thing is that trade is considered as a game changer. So trade increases, of course, the import and export quota of goods and services, and this, with that number of working places for women can be raised. The same for the wages, of course, and also economic equality among men and women. Thus it leads that the economic welfare will be increased. It is interesting that, of course, those countries who are more open to trade also have usually a higher level of gender equality, because they need more workforce, which they sometimes cannot only fulfill with male workers, but they also have a need often for high-skilled workers, so to say, and that's why it's a common understanding that discriminatory trade regulations have to be prohibited, especially when they hinder the market access of women and or discriminate women orientated or dominated industries, like, for example, textile industries or the health sector or some other areas. And especially in this case, trade agreements work in the field that they reduce tariffs or non-tariff barriers, and to see if they have a gender perspective or not. And to empower women, the cross-border trade has to be made more attractive, either to trade besides the tariff reductions and the reduction of other barriers. You can either use trade facilitation and also what Tatjana already mentioned, easier access to finance. This is one of the biggest problems when it comes to developing countries, the access to finance for women, but also I think that there was some years ago also in Germany a study, and they found out that with the same business idea, men got much more easier a credit than women did. So, and it was complete the same business plan and everything. So, but of course the trust, or not of course, but trust was much more, was higher than the trust in women. And since trade is considered as a game changer, it tries to various institutions take action. So one of the main play in the field of trade is always the World Trade Organization, also the World Bank, the OECD, or the UNCTAD are being the ones who are, I would say, are the most important ones. There are also the IMF and some others, but I would say when it comes to trade, the WTO has an own working group which deals with gender-related aspects of trade. and another committee, the World Bank and the OECD, financing a lot of studies and surveys and analysis in that field. And they try to address women not only as workforce and producers, but also as business owners and especially as a decision maker, meaning either on a governmental level or maybe as part of arbitrational boards. The programs vary from a data collection analysis, but also to entrepreneur programs. When it comes to developing countries, there are so often already reported about the microcredit programs for women. The WTO has a special program which is called Aid for Trade, where there is assistance, especially for developing countries, when it comes to take part in trade negotiations and in meetings of the WTO. And there's a special women's program or women's assistance, however you want to call it, which takes place. And of course, there's always technical assistance from all of those international organizations. When it comes to trade agreements, they include various topics. So also they are called trade agreements. They mainly, that's of course the main or the core and the heart of the agreement are tariff reductions, trade in services, trade in goods, intellectual property rights, but they also include trade-related topics like competition, IP, labor, education, environment. So nowadays, a trade agreement of the European Union consists of several hundreds of pages. So not only the tariff schedules, but also in fields where you maybe at the moment not think of. So and of course, there are also agreements which include the topic of gender. There's only one exclusive agreement. It's the Global Trade and Gender Agreement, which came into force, I think, last year among Canada, Chile, and New Zealand. It deals with various provision and tries to include in all areas or in all trade-related areas, the gender perspective. At the moment, there are 305 trade agreements notified to the WTO. This is there are a little bit more, but those are notified are much easier to analyze. And out of them, 83 include explicit provisions on gender. So 178, they touch the gender topic, but more in a very general term. But 83, that's already a good number, deal in some parts of the agreement explicitly with the topic of gender diversity or gender equality. The main players are maybe not as a surprise Canada, the EU, but also Chile, Israel, Japan, UK, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay. To be honest, I don't know why there is such a strong focus in the South American countries. Something what I at the moment try to research, but of course the EU and also UK are part of the European Convention of Human Rights, and of course they try to uphold or to include also human rights topics in all fields of policy. Interestingly, especially customs union like the EU, but also others like Mercosur, for example, favorize gender-related provisions. Also, this is something I try to find a reasoning at the moment. but maybe because you do not only you do not only have one or two countries included, but mostly more than those two, and maybe this brings in more interest in such topics. As I already said, also when those countries have a high human development level, like the EU, then you have more comprehensive provisions on gender. When it comes to the content of those provisions, it started with mostly with a general call for cooperation on gender issues. But recently, you will find many more specific provisions, which especially include a framework for such cooperation. So it started 10, 15, or let's say 20 years ago with a clause which just stated the parties should cooperate on gender equality in the field of whatever. And now a clause on cooperation activities mostly, or not mostly, but often looks like that. It's a very long provision, and where they first state that they acknowledge the benefit of sharing their respective experiences in designing, implementing, monitoring, and strengthening policy and programs. States the aim, and then often they list and who will be the addressees, and then often lists the areas of cooperation. Here, this is the Article 13.3 in the Canada-Israel FTA, and they included the encouraging of capacity building and skills enhancement of women at work and in business, promoting financial inclusion, because this is considered as one of the main problem, including also financial training. Many women do not have an understanding how finances works, but also advancing women's leadership and developing women's networks. That's often networks are often gentlemen's clubs, and there the access for women is not the best one, but also developing better practices, so an exchange of best practice examples, fostering the representation in decision making, promoting female entrepreneurship, and the other thing is what is maybe the area where at the moment all countries, but all organizations also focus on our gender-based analysis, and especially also sharing method and procedures, how to compare the data, how to use the indicators, and so on. Because without such statistics, it's very hard to make a fact-based reasoning why women should be included in business activities. And that's why this is usually always part of any agreement which considers gender issues. Further on, most of the trade agreements try to influence the national or the domestic gender-related policies by having a clause which encourages the parties to adopt or harmonize and maintain regulations in the area of gender, and then especially in the field of labor, social, and educational policies. Often you can also see there a clause to prevent gender-based discrimination at the workplace. And of course, the trade agreements often include definitions and gender-related principles, and most of the trade agreements are referring to the CEDAW or to the Beijing Declaration, which allows them to include many more gender-related topics. And interestingly, some agreements also include institutional arrangements. So they use, every trade agreement has mostly a council, a committee, or something else. And also there, sometimes they set up a gender council, or they use the general council, which has to deal also with gender issues. This is a big step forward compared to a general, how to say that, a general clause which just asks for cooperation in very general terms. So nowadays trade agreements are much more detailed. But it has to be said, of course, they are no, how to say that, hard regulations or hard provisions. It is very, or you either not be able to really get a right out of it, or you have another problem when it comes to the dispute settlement. So most of the FTAs have nowadays a dispute settlement mechanism, but this has either the gender provisions are excluded from that mechanism, or individuals have not the right to bring a claim in front of that mechanism. And then it's up to the countries who are party of the FTA to bring it up. There is an interesting exemption in Article 2311 of the USMCE. That's the former NAFTA. So the trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the US, which allows public submissions by individuals in the case when labor rights are violated. So first, it says nothing about gender, but the case more or less is a gender discrimination case, because two Mexican women, together with a supporting association, filed a claim against the US because the US has has a visa regime which is used discriminatory when it comes to the to women. So one visa which is used for, let's say, lower skilled work are given much more often to women than to men, and the other one, which allows for highly for highly skilled and also then a better paid work, is often refused when it comes to women. Also, they show that they have the qualification, and it will be seen in the future if that if that claim will be accepted, and especially then if the two Mexican women can prove that there is a systemic discrimination. But this would show that, of course, trade agreements do not only give the right to free trade, but also give individuals the possibility to change labor conditions, which you first would not think about when it comes to a trade agreement. So at the end of the day, maybe we have to change and do not call it anymore a trade agreement, but also maybe some other title would be more significant. But at the moment, FTAs are often criticized for their approach that they do not really take into account human rights, but or that they are discriminatory when it comes to women. But of course, they also try to change that. It's not done in between a day, but when you compare the situation 20 years ago, it's much better. And we will see how this gender topic will be considered in future trade agreements, especially also of the European Union. Yeah, that's from my side. So let me know if you have any